My wife was on to me. My wife was on to me all week. Buying 30 new chairs in my house. So I did that. Welcome to students, particularly my wife's students at COB, English 120. The key statement tonight is we need your young, fresh energy. All these members of the society, I'm kind of one of the youngest, and I'm 72. Our thoughts go out to our stalwart committee member, Andrea Major, on the death of her mother, Millicent Monies. I think she was 84 years old. So, you know, keep on doing your prayers. New things for the new year. The Historical Society are becoming into the 21st century. We've got a set of postcards for sale at the back for $2.75 each. I don't know if you remember Lee Ingram. She was a lady that helped us with the 2 sets of diagonal pulling screens. Well, these are sketches that Diana Fullinger made. They made nice postcards that you can purchase. And if you look here, our new Apple computer, top of the line. My only problem is that
I'm sorry, buddy.
both the Bethell and Cable want to charge us for a business internet, which is over $100, and we want to pay the residential. So we're working on that. If anybody knows anybody big in Bethell, and I've got to thank Robert Dorset. He's the man with the camera there. He's had us on YouTube for the last year, and tonight I actually can announce that we're on live stream, so that while you are watching this here, people in America or anywhere in the world can watch it. Boy, the Bahamas Historical Society has come a long way. So I'm very proud, and I know it's a sin to be proud, but I'm very proud. I'm proud of what we're accomplishing, but I'm very proud of our guest speaker. She's a young lady, and as soon as she wrote to me and put an article in the journal, this is this year's journal, I thought, well, this is some young Bahamian talent, some fresh young energy. And the journals are on sale, $10 each, or you can get it free with a membership. So anybody who's signed up, you get a membership, you get a journal. And then the other thing I'm proud of is this is the first guest speaker ever that's brought their own refreshments. We've got refreshments afterwards, so you're very welcome to just stay for that. I'll cover everything. Yeah, I met the speaker's mother a few weeks ago, and it was so refreshing to see a lady come in and she wanted to buy a journal and see if it was work. And she told me that ever since this girl was young, she used to go to the library and read and books. And she wanted to be a teacher. And I'm very happy to see that that's what she became. So, our guest speaker is a graduate professor at Barry University, where she lectures educational students in research methodology with emphasis on research designs and methods, emphasizing the underlying assumptions and inquiry aims. In addition, she provides consultation to schools which seek organizational restructuring by providing first-hand knowledge of current school practices and programming options. Our speaker obtained both her associate degree in social studies and her Bachelor of Education at the College of the Bahamas, along with a teaching certificate. The teaching certificate was in conjunction with the University of the West Indies. And she holds an MPA from Nova Southeastern University with an emphasis on group dynamics and conflict resolution, and a PhD in education with a specialization in leadership from Barry University. So I have a pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Jennifer Bethell, and she will speak to us on female slaves in the Bahamas. Thank you. I hope our new equipment is going to work well.
First, I'd like to thank Mr. Lawlor for inviting me to become a member of the Historical Society. And I've seen many persons here this evening with applications, so hopefully our family will grow by the end of the night. And I'm so happy to be here. I met Gail Saunders and like Mr. Lawlor said, I was always going to the library and reading her work, and it was such a privilege for her to actually come up to me and introduce herself. I felt like I was doing royalty, research royalty with reference to the Bahamas. But to all of you, thank you so much for coming out and to support this work, and I definitely hope to continue in this trend, and hopefully that many of you will actually become a part of research and growth and development within our country. This research focuses on female slaves in the Bahamas and looks directly at the multiple roles that they held. But more importantly, what I hope to accomplish by the end of the evening is actually to provide a nexus between what we have unearthed on Earth with reference to those roles and what they Black and Indian women. And from there begin to really unearth the essence of being a Black and Indian woman, because many of our counterparts within the West Indies has already begun to do this. And according to Mahanti, it's difficult for us to actually find meaning to everyone's phenomena, even though we may have experienced it. So even though we know that slavery existed within this part of the world, within this region, the experience of the Hindu women would definitely have been different from their sisters within other Caribbean countries, as well as North America. So actually the research is focusing on what it was like for a Bahamian woman and what has translated into the modern day Bahamian woman. With just a brief overview of history, because many of my students, when I taught history, always ask the question, well, where did slavery begin? So just a brief overview. During the Stone Age, really, there was no form of slavery, mainly because persons were hunters and gatherers, so there was no settlement, permanent settlement. With the establishment of ancient civilizations, both within Africa, Europe, and Asia, persons actually had the ability to settle down. And it was there where we actually began to see systematic enslavement of people around the world. During that time, we developed into medieval Europe. In medieval Europe, slavery really focused on religious aspects, trying to convert persons. Within Africa, Africa was one of those ancient civilizations where slavery had already existed. But slavery as itself was completely different from the one that was established through the transatlantic slave trade. With the advent of the transatlantic slave trade, which began with the Portuguese, we actually had persons coming over to the Western world and actually setting up plantations and transporting slaves here. Many persons are under the perception that slaves only came from possibly South Africa, but we actually had slaves that were imported from all around Africa as well as Asia as a result of the Muslims engaging in the slave trade and transporting persons to different parts of the region. The purpose of slavery was simply to acquire cheap labor, the best possible cheap labor. But when slavery started within the Western world, it actually wasn't as cheap as we thought it was. So the question then became, how is it that we can find a large supply of persons that are cheaper and more importantly that we are able to control? The system itself, over the course of the period, actually became more established when the time the Portuguese entered or started the trade with the inclusion of the Spanish as well as British and other European nations. Female slaves in the Bahamas. With the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492, we actually had the history of this part of the world actually beginning. And the decimation of the native populations of Caribbean Arawaks, especially particularly the Arawaks in the Bahamas, meant that there was a vacant supply of labor. The arrival of the Lutheran adventurers would possibly be the first period that we actually can account for slaves being in the Bahamas, and particularly female slaves more than likely would have been included in that. And so the phenomenon of the black female emerged and has existed within the Bahamas since that period, 60 and 400, when the Lutheran adventurers came. With the sale of women, the price ranged and it varied. Most important thing for slaves was the ability to work. That was why initially mostly men were transported on the slave trade. However, the value was realized when women were actually able to perform the same number of tasks as men. In addition to that, we found that within Africa, some societies were actually matriarchal, where others were patriarchal. In those societies that were patriarchal, we actually had more women being infused into the slave trade as opposed to those that were matriarchal. Because in those matriarchal societies, women were actually in positions of authority and actually able to dictate exactly what happened within their various societies. But ultimately, women were purchased for their ability to work. Those who were valued higher, that was related as a result of their beauty, their skill, and their skin color. And as one slave wrote, I'd like to direct your attention, if God has bestowed beauty upon a slave woman, it will prove her greatest curse. That which commands admiration in the white woman only hastens the degradation of the female slave. Creating a nexus to the past really simply means understanding exactly what slavery meant to women of color. Within Africa, we know that slavery existed and it existed for a long time. However, the meaning behind which persons were enslaved is completely different from those that were established within the Western world. And I think that is important for us to understand, because women within Africa, many of those within matriarchal societies, actually had a power that was unknown or unconventional to European women and to European slave traders, because many of them on their journeys accounted for the difference that they had seen within these women. For example, we actually had an all-female brigade in Dahomey, where women actually consisted of a military brigade whose responsibility was to protect the king. This was something that was actually unheard of, and it lasted well into the 19th century. And many slave traders on their way to Africa actually reported accounts of these women defending villages and fortresses, trying to release their tribesmen. So this here actually lets us know that the history of these women actually is one that is very rich, and one, of course, that is not really pronounced as much as it should be. In terms of slave women within the New World, switching back, women worked in the fields and the houses just as those of men. The masses shaped the perceptions of them, even though we realize that the experience of women were distinctly different. Much of the history that has been written about women has been written by men, which simply means that her perspective and her story has often been neglected and ignored, and the questions which were often raised were not raised from a woman's perspective. So often we have been hidden from history. As part of my research and part of this presentation, it's always to provide an understanding of a group of women from their perspective. And of course, the underlying assumption of that as well is the fact that the history that I'm using to reveal this information, of course, has been written from the other perspective of the Anglo-Saxon man. So of course, it's subject to many different interpretations. And of course, that is the purpose of research, to continue to revisit issues, ask pertinent questions, and try again to bridge some type of understanding between our past and our future. The work of women within the region focused primarily on work, family life, and resistance. Female slaves had two works. One, of course, which was their public life, which that of the master, as well as their slave life, which was their private life. What did they do in their own time once they were off from work? The multiplicity of roles were simultaneous, especially within the Bahamas, because we do know that within the Bahamas, we did not have a stable plantation society. So many times, slaves, upon completion of their tasks, had free time to themselves, or if they were not doing one task, such as working in cotton plantation fields, they may have been attending to the care, especially